Hi, my name is James Gambrell, and today I'm going to talk to you about policies and laws and the history of teaching English learners in the United States. I'm talking fast because my first one took 26 minutes and I have to make it in under 15. Most of my information today comes from this excellent book, and I recommend you get it. If you If you do not have it, and if you want to learn more today, James Crawford's Educating English Learners, 2004. I wish he'd update it because we need a new one. So briefly, before the 1968 Bilingual Education Act, there were other language education programs, but they were largely ignored by federal or national policy. Um, and so the myth was kind of the sink or swim, the immersion myth. And contrary to that myth, most children sank rather than swam. I think the numbers are usually around 70%. And the dropout rates were extremely high in the 1960s. So as the civil rights movement started to energize uh, those who were advocates for English learners, wanted to push for better laws. So in the 1968 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, um, the Title VII was called the Bilingual Education, monikered Education Act, and it was to provide transitional bilingual education to prepare English learners to succeed in mainstream classrooms. Minority language schooling did exist before this, but it wasn't an issue of national policy. Um, so that was 1968. In 1975, about 2,800 Chinese uh, speakers in San Francisco schools were not being given adequate language instruction to prepare them. They had kind of that sink or swim model. So court, a lawsuit from this group went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they sided on the side of the English learners and their families, based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that you cannot discriminate based on race, color, or especially national origin for this one. And this was exciting because of the two bolded statements that failing to provide language supports makes a mockery out of public education. And as a matter of simple justice, schools needed to provide ways for English learners to access the curriculum. Sink or swim was not enough. Um, this wasn't based on research. It didn't really exist extensively at the time, but just a desire to improve education for English learners. I love this direct quote from the Supreme Court. There is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. Very interesting, especially in today's polarized climate politically. It was a unanimous Supreme Court, and they found that districts, and I want to keep pointing out districts, so we'll talk about that in a minute, must provide affirmative steps to overcome language barriers. However, they're the highest court of the land, and they're lawyers. They're not educators, so they provided this ruling, but of course they didn't have pedagogy steps. And I will let you read that if you're interested, but I don't want to make this one 26 minutes. So the Bilingual Education Act of 1968 provided funding for research, and we now have almost 50 years of research because of that. The Lau versus Nichols made accessing the curriculum a right of every student, especially English learners. But they didn't provide pedagogical steps. So in 1981, a district court, and I forget which one, it was in Texas, uh, students were saying that Texas courts were not meeting English learners' needs. And so Castaneda versus Picard, 1981, uh, further defined or detailed the Lau versus Nichols. And the three-pronged test to see if a district is providing supports is one, They must provide supports based on educational theory recognized as sound by experts, so by teachers, by college professors, by educational experts. Two, the resources, personnel, and practices must be reasonably calculated to implement the program effectively. So saying we do it in English isn't good enough. You have to provide language supports. And then number three, these programs must be evaluated and, if necessary, restructured to ensure that language barriers are being overcome. So, what's important here is because of this, I think it's about 5 years, and I should have looked that up. Um, each district has to provide a Lau plan from the Lau versus Nichols decision to the Office of Civil Rights to show that they're trying to improve instruction for English learners. And they have to prove these three-pronged tests, that they're using sound theory, that they're using their resources effectively, and that they're evaluating and improving their programs. Um, this next one I added to Crawford because it's become super important in the last year or so, and that's Plyer versus Doe. This also took place in Texas and then made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Texas schools wanted to charge students whose home language wasn't English, no, who were undocumented, I'm sorry. Students who were undocumented, they wanted to charge them $1,000 per pupil to be able to have the right to attend public schools. The Supreme Court struck that down, saying that it was unconstitutional, that schools are not allowed to differentiate or discriminate based on documentation status. And so you can't do that with funding, and you can't do that with the schooling that you provide. And the reasoning for this case was that students under the age of 18 have very little choice of whether they immigrate to the United States with their parents or not. It's a parental decision, and so children shouldn't be held accountable for the choices of their parents. Because of that, later court rulings found that this only applied to K-12 students, and that immigrant children, they had different tiers or different costs, would lead to the creation and perpetuation of a subclass of illiterates within our boundaries, surely adding to the problems and costs of unemployment, welfare, and crime. And so, what they were trying to say is it benefits the public good that all students are educated. Has become especially important with a negative rhetoric around immigration and people as high as the Secretary of Education of our country saying that, oh, schools should decide whether or not they want to report immigrant children to immigration and custom enforcement, and it's illegal. We can't discriminate. We cannot give different schooling because a student is undocumented. So that early 1980s was kind of a pinnacle. Throughout the 1990s, however, the word bilingual started to become polarized and politicized. So in 1998, voters adopted Proposition 227, which essentially dismantled and got rid of, not just dismantled, but also made illegal most forms of bilingual education in the state of California. Within a year or so, Arizona and Massachusetts passed similar statutes, and that started the chain of events I'm about to go into, but I don't want to go on longer than 15 minutes. Uh, Good news is that it was repealed last year in 2017 in California. In 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act, this was under the Bush administration, um, expunged and expelled and got rid of uh, any reference to bilingual education in this Elementary and Secondary Education Act that they nicknamed No Child Left Behind. And so they also instigated and required high stakes testings in English and encouraged schools to move towards all English. The scientifically based research, you should read it as high stakes testing. So, ironically, when political support was higher for bilingual education in the 60s, when we had not absolutely, no, very little research on bilingual education, whereas after 40 some odd years of research indicating that students who learn in their primary language do better in the second language, which in this case would be English. Um, it's a key to develop literacy in your home language that benefits all subjects, including English, as students move throughout the line. So, well, Crawford points out there may have been some racism because up until the 1950s, most immigrants were immigrating from Western Europe, whereas in the 80s and 90s, when these laws started to come, they were coming from Latin America and Southeast Asia. And so Crawford indicates racism might be a point to that. And this last bullet I'll bring you to is that the English only movement started to really exploit and to give false information and promote false narratives about bilingualism and immigrants starting around this time. Um, and just to show that this transcends political party, Obama's admission race to the top, it added more competition. I mean, it did give funding instead of take funding away, but it still relied on the same high stakes test. Common Core state standards, which Georgia doesn't have, but 46 states started with it, really embedded English as the primary driving force. And then the 2006, 17, 16, sorry, 16, Every Student Succeeds Act also still is more of the same according to Dave Stovall. So the question that I'm trying to get through to you, or the kind of the is, why do I need to care about language laws and policies and that kind of thing? The reason we need to care about it is policies matter. They directly impact students. The Bilingual Education Act in 1968 gave us a ton of money for research. It allocated funding so that we could understand how do students learn the best. The Lau versus Nichols made education a right, the access to the curriculum, not equal treatment, but access became important. Castaneda versus Picard told us we that we were able to define what makes quality education. The Plyer versus Doe said we have to treat students, we cannot discriminate against undocumented students. And so these policies, these practices impact students in real classrooms. And so for us as teachers, what are we supposed to do about it? And that's what we'll be doing throughout this course is what are the biases of different ways of looking at of teaching English learners? What are the underlying assumptions and values, and who does it privilege? Who does it disadvantage? What does a particular text do to advantage or disadvantage certain students? Who has the power and who's trying to maintain or share that power? And so, in the attempt to keep this short, I'm going to make it quick and say that it matters. And that is the slideshow. Thank you for your time.